Okay, so now we are going to tackle about the historical background of the 1943 Constitution. So, the 1943 Constitution enumerates the duties and rights of the citizens, requires the government to develop Tagalog as the national language, and stipulates that 1 year after the termination of the Great East Asia War or the World War II, so it is a new constitution shall be formulated and adopted to replace this constitution. So this constitution creates a republican state with a powerful executive branch and subordinate legislative and judicial branches. So the executive power is vested in the president, who is to be elected by the members of the National Assembly from among themselves. So the president is the head of the government and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So the powers of the president are first to veto any bill of the assembly. Next is to promulgate regulations when the assembly is not in session, and also in times of war or national emergency. So necessary power to declare martial law, to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and also to appoint the members of the Council of State and officials of the local government. So a limited legislative power is exercised by the um, unicameral National Assembly, whose members, like the president, are not directly elected by the people. Rather, the assembly is to compose of representatives from each province, elected in Calibapi conventions throughout the country with appointed governors and mayors as ex officio members. So, the judicial power is exercised by the Supreme Court, whose justices, together with judges of lower courts, are to be appointed by the president. So that is the historical background of the 1943 Constitution. And now let's tackle about their issues. So first, we are going to tackle about the social issues. All right.
Okay, so the social issues in the 1943 Constitution is first, we have sexual slavery. So during the 1942 to 45 Japanese occupation of the Philippines and other parts of Asia, the Japanese army established a system of sexual slavery, In the Philippines, more than 1,000 women, some of them underage, were imprisoned as sexual slavery hostages. The institutionalized system of female wartime slavery established and institutionalized by the Imperial Japanese Army during Second World War resulted in crimes against international law of the time, particularly the 1926 Slavery Convention and the 1933 Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Women of the Fool. It was a far-ranging system of sexual enslavement. It stated in the Article 7, Duties and Rights of the Citizen, Section 2, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied the equal protection of the laws. So person deprived of liberty means a person who has been arrested, held in lawful custody, detained, or imprisoned in execution of a lawful sentence. Due process is what separates a free society from a police state when the 14th Amendment of the Constitution says that the government shall not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That doesn't mean that the government cannot take away a person's life, liberty, or property, but that it cannot take those things away without first giving the person a fair chance to defend him or herself. For instance, the government cannot imprison someone or take away his or her children without allowing the person to challenge the government's actions. And the second social issue is national language. During the Second World War, the Japanese occupied the Philippines and established the Second Philippine Republic. Part of Japan's plan for dominance in Asia was to remove Western influence from its occupied Asian countries and to encourage local culture. This is reflected in Article 9, Section 2 of the 1943 Constitution, which removed English and Spanish as official languages and stated, the government shall take steps towards the development and propagation of Tagalog as the national language. Next.
So for political issues, the 1943 Constitution remained in force in Japanese-controlled areas of the Philippines, but was never recognized as legitimate or binding by the governments of the United States, the Commonwealth of the Philippines, or the guerrilla organizations loyal to them. So in late 1944, President Laurel declared war on the United States and the British Empire and proclaimed martial law during ruling by decree. So his government in turn went into exile in December 1944, first to Taiwan and then Japan. After the announcement of Japan's surrender, Laurel formally dissolved the Second Republic. The 1943 Constitution provided for strong executive powers. The legislature consisted of a unicameral National Assembly, and only those considered to be anti-US or anti-US could stand for election, although in practice, most legislators were appointed rather than elected. So next. Until the 1960s, the Second Republic and its officers were not viewed as a legitimate Philippine government or as having any standing except for the Second Republic era Supreme Court, whose decisions, limited to reviews of criminal and commercial cases as part of a policy of discretion by Chief Justice Jose Yulo, continued to be part of official records. This was made easier by the Commonwealth government in exile, never constituting a Supreme Court and the formal vacancy in the position of Chief Justice for the Commonwealth with the execution of Jose Abad Santos by the Japanese. It was only during the Macapagal administration that a partial political rehabilitation of the Japanese era republic took place, with the official recognition of Laurel as a former president and the addition of his cabinet other officials to the roster of past government's officials. So, however, the 1943 Constitution was not taught in schools, and the laws of 1943 to 44 National Assembly were never recognized as valid or relevant. Next.
Now let's proceed to economic issues. The first one is food shortages. Due to the Japanese invasion establishing the unofficial Second Philippine Republic, the economic growth receded and food shortages occurred. Prioritizing the shortages of food, Jose Laurel, the appointed president, organized an agency to distribute rice, even though most of the rice was confiscated by Japanese soldiers. Manila was one of the many places in the country that suffered from severe shortages due mainly to a typhoon that struck the country in November 1943. The people were forced to cultivate private plots which produced root crops like kangkong. The Japanese, in order to raise rice production in the country, brought a quick maturing Horai rice. Horai rice was expected to make the Philippines self-sufficient in rice by 1943, but rains during 1942 prevented this to happen. Next, Japanese money. The first issue in 1942 consisted of denominations of of 1, 5, 10, and 50 centavos and 1, 5, and 10 pesos. The next year brought replacement notes of the 1, 5, and 10 pesos, while 1944 ushered in a 100 peso note, and soon after an inflationary 500 pesos note. In 1945, the Japanese issued a 1,000 pesos note. This set of new money, which was printed even before the war, became known in the Philippines as Mickey Mouse money due to its very low value caused by severe inflation. In 1944, a box of matches cost more than 100 Mickey Mouse pesos. In 1945, a kilogram of kamote cost around 1,000 Mickey Mouse pesos. Inflation plugged the country with a devaluation of the Japanese money, evidenced by a 60% inflation experienced in January 1944. So there was an inflation and the Japanese pesos were worth very little at the time. Next.
Next is cultural issues. First, Philippine literature was interrupted during Japanese period. During the Japanese period, the Philippine literature in English was stopped and writers turned to writing in Filipino. The Japanese authorities, with extreme hate to the Americans, did their best to turn the Filipino sympathy away from them. They rewarded handsomely the Filipinos who are faithful to them. Japanese period has been called one of the darkest days in the history and literary tradition of the Philippines. In prose literature, the weekly Liwayway magazine was put into strict surveillance and was managed by a Japanese named Ishiwara. The Japanese language, Nippongo, was introduced but not well embraced by the Filipino despite it is being forcefully taught by the Japanese. With the prohibition of writing literacy thesis in English language, Filipino literature was given a break. Many Filipino writers wrote plays, poems, short stories, etc in the Tagalog and other vernacular language. Topics and themes were often about life in the provinces to escape Japanese control and censorship. Next is media and publishing. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, when the Japanese used the corporate media that had developed under the US colonial regime to influence and shape public opinion, the guerrilla and underground press met the citizen need for accurate information on the state of the country, the anti-Japanese resistance, and developments on the war fronts across the world. The death of historical writing on early radio is partly due to the loss of documents and records of pre-war radio in the Philippines due to massive destruction brought about by the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during Second World War.